Tonight, we uncover a war that was never declared, yet burned across centuries. A war waged not with armies, but with sermons. Not with swords, but with silence. It began in candle-lit chambers and cloistered halls, where sacred scripts were rewritten and entire lifetimes of knowledge were set to flame. But this war was not against demons or heretics. It was against women, healers, midwives, star watchers, those who remembered the old ways, who read the language of the moon, who carried remedies in their hands and the rhythm of seasons in their blood. They were not hunted because they were dangerous. They were hunted because they could not be controlled. The church did not just burn books. It buried names. It outlawed touch. It rebranded wisdom as witchcraft and turned the body into a battlefield for the soul. And what survived was forced underground, hidden in gardens, in lullabies, in lace. This is not just a story about the past. It is a spell still echoing through the present. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because once you see what the fire tried to erase, you will never look at history the same way again. They said the night was holy, but the light came not from heaven, it came from the fire. Flames licking the air, faces glowing like masks of judgment, and in the center, a woman who once healed their children, now called a witch. The crowd did not whisper her name anymore. They whispered words like purity, sin, and salvation. And as the smoke rose to the stars, no one asked what was really burning. It was not her alone, it was knowledge itself. The word witch did not begin as evil. It once meant wise, a knower, a reader of nature's quiet language. But somewhere between the fall of Rome and the rise of cathedrals, wisdom became dangerous. The church, growing in influence and fear, began to draw a circle around what could and could not be known. And inside that circle, there was no place left for women who spoke to the earth, who understood herbs, the moon, or birth. The veil began to fall slowly, not through war, but through stories. Every tale told from the pulpit painted the healer as a temptress, the midwife as a servant of the devil. They turned the language of creation into sin. A woman who used roots to heal a fever was now accused of using demons to do so. A woman who comforted the dying was said to consort with spirits. The old ways of the village, once celebrated in festivals and songs, became whispers in the dark, and each whisper became a trial. The church did not call it war, it called it purification. But the targets were almost always the same. The women who remembered how to live without permission, those who carried the memory of an older world. Their destruction began not in the courts, but in confession. A rumour planted here, a sermon spoken there, and slowly entire villages learned to see their mothers and sisters as threats. Every time a crop failed, a child fell ill, or a dream unsettled a priest, another fire was lit. No armies marched, yet this was conquest, a conquest of memory. The records of early Europe show almost no female scholars left after the 12th century. Midwives disappeared from city registries. Herbal manuscripts were rewritten or vanished. What was once the art of healing became the art of accusation. The veil of ashes covered not only bodies, but truth. Beneath that veil, a question was buried so deep few dared to ask it again. Why did knowledge become the enemy? And why did the church fear the hands that could heal? For centuries, people believed the fires had ended, but their smoke still lingers in language. In every time a woman is called too curious, too strange, too powerful, the veil is not gone. It only waits for someone to lift it, and when we finally do, we might see not witches, but teachers, scientists, and healers the world was never meant to forget. Long before the word witch was whispered in fear, there were women who spoke the language of the earth. They were not outcasts. They were the center of the village, the ones people sought when a child burned with fever, when the sky darkened without warning, when love or birth or death came too soon. Their wisdom did not come from books, but from rhythm, from watching the stars rise and fall, from learning how the moon guided the tides and the seeds beneath the soil. In the world before churches and kings, the seasons themselves were sacred texts, and women were the ones who could read them. They knew that spring did not begin with a date, but with the thaw of rivers. They marked time by the phases of the moon, each crescent and shadow a page in a celestial calendar. These women were the first scientists, though no one called them that. They mixed herbs to ease pain, used stones to predict weather, and mapped the cycles of the sky long before telescopes were ever dreamed of. When a new mother laboured through the night, it was the midwife who whispered prayers to the moon, trusting that its light would guide both mother and child safely into dawn. Their power was not domination, it was harmony. They lived as part of nature's pattern, believing that to harm the earth was to harm oneself. But then came the slow turning of the age. As Christianity spread across Europe, old customs were not destroyed outright, they were absorbed and renamed. Festivals for the solstice became saints' days, harvest offerings were turned into tithes, and the moon was stripped of her holiness. The wisdom of women was labelled superstition. The herbs became poison, the chants became spells, and the healers who had once been praised were now feared. It was not sudden, it was a quiet rewriting of memory. A mother would teach her daughter the names of plants, but the priest would warn her never to speak of it. Generations later, the knowledge became a secret passed only in whispers, carried like an ember from one lifetime to another. In ancient Celtic and Norse traditions, priestesses and wise women held equal standing with warriors and chiefs. They were counselors, astronomers, keepers of the tribe's stories. Yet by the time cathedrals rose in stone, their temples had been erased. Where once stood circles of stone open to the sky, there were now crosses and bells. The sacred moon had become a symbol of temptation. The sun, the masculine light, was declared divine. And the world forgot that once, before history was written by the victors, wisdom wore a woman's face. The word witch would come later, born not from darkness, but from the ashes of names that had been forbidden. Before that word existed, the world still had magic, but it was not the kind that frightened people. It was the kind that healed, comforted, and kept the stars in their places. There was a time when the moon ruled the human imagination. Every rising silver disk was a mirror of the body and its rhythms. Women especially saw themselves in it. Their cycles followed its phases, their celebrations followed its light, and their stories said that the moon was not a distant stone but a living clock, guiding birth, growth, decay, and renewal. To lose sight of the moon was to lose the sense of balance between darkness and light. In ancient villages, people marked months by her waxing and waning. The calendar was not a grid of numbers, but a breathing rhythm of night skies. Women were the keepers of this rhythm. They measured the right time to plant, to harvest, to heal, and to rest. The moon's light was not feared. It was a sign of alignment between heaven and earth. But as new beliefs spread, another light rose to dominance. The sun, eternal and unchanging, came to symbolize divine perfection. The church built its power upon that light, declaring that truth could not shift or wane like the moon. The masculine sun became holy. The feminine moon was reduced to reflection, seen as dependent, weaker, a symbol of change that must be controlled. It was a quiet revolution hidden in theology. The world was no longer to move in circles, but in lines, straight lines from creation to judgment, from sin to salvation. the cycle became a curse. The moon that once marked sacred time was turned into a symbol of instability. Women, bound to its rhythm, were said to be ruled by it, their emotions called wild, their bodies suspect. A worldview that had once honoured balance was replaced with one that demanded hierarchy. The moon's theft was not only cosmic, it was cultural. The lunar festivals that celebrated fertility and renewal were outlawed or renamed. The priestesses who danced beneath its light vanished from the records, replaced by stories of temptation and moral weakness. The church claimed to offer a new calendar, a solar calendar, precise and eternal. But that precision came at a price. Time no longer flowed with nature. It became mechanical, imposed, measured not by tides or stars, but by bells and sermons. Women who still followed the moon's ways were told they followed the devil, yet they kept watching the night sky. They remembered that darkness was not evil, only half of a greater whole. And though the sermons preached that salvation came from the sun, it was the moon that continued to rise, silent and patient, carrying memories the church could not erase. Even today, when we look at the moon, we are seeing what was taken. Its light still belongs to no one. It shines on every roof, every field, every hidden garden where women once whispered to it for guidance. The moon's theft was never complete. It waits, as it always has, for humanity to remember that truth does not burn with the sun's fire. It glows quietly, in cycles, refusing to end. Long before crosses crowned every hill, the lands of Europe were filled with names whispered to the wind. Brigid, Diana, Freya, the nameless mothers of rivers and forests. They were not imagined as gods above, but as presences within. Every stream, every grove, every flame had its guardian. And those guardians often took the shape of women. They were the heart of life's cycles, bringers of rain, keepers of fertility, healers of the sick. People offered milk, honey, and songs to them, not out of fear, but gratitude. The world was alive with balance, and the sacred feminine was its pulse. When the church began to spread, it did not march in with swords alone. It came with words. It came with stories that shifted meanings. The same goddesses who once blessed harvests were renamed as witches or demons. Brigid of the eternal flame became Saint Brigid, her sacred fires placed under church supervision. Diana, the huntress of the moon, was turned into a spirit of temptation, a symbol of the flesh that led men astray. The river mothers who guarded waters became sirens, their songs rewritten as traps for the soul. The conversion of Europe was not only a war of faith, but a rewriting of imagination. Each time a goddess was baptized into sainthood or condemned into hell, a piece of the old harmony was buried. The people still saw her in their dreams, but they were told she was evil. They still felt her in the turning of seasons, but they were told that only God made the crops grow. The sacred power that once flowed freely through the world was rerouted into altars controlled by men. For a time, the two worlds coexisted. Villagers prayed to Mary in the day and left offerings to the old spirits at night, but the church noticed. Laws were passed, sermons thundered, confessors demanded names. The folk gods were declared false, and anyone who called upon them risked accusation. Slowly, the old names faded from public speech. In their place came saints who performed the same miracles but under the seal of church approval. It was a clever transformation. Erasure disguised as devotion. Even art followed the change. The horned gods of forests became images of the devil. The serpent once linked to healing became the symbol of sin. The same energies that once nurtured life were recast as chaos to be tamed. Yet beneath every church built atop a pagan shrine, the earth still remembers. The wells still carry the names of forgotten goddesses carved faintly in stone. Every candle lit to a saint is a distant echo of a flame once lit to the divine feminine. When goddesses became demons, the world did not lose its magic. It simply went underground, waiting beneath centuries of fear and doctrine, because no matter how many times her name was changed, the sacred woman never truly vanished. She learned to speak through silence, through dreams, through the moonlight that still touches every sleeping village that once called her mother. When the flames of empire faded and kingdoms crumbled, the monks began to write. Inside cold stone rooms, the sound of quills replaced the clash of swords. These monasteries became the last sanctuaries of knowledge, but also the first gates through which all learning would have to pass. In their scriptoria, men cloaked in silence copied the wisdom of the ancient world line by line. They told themselves they were preserving civilization, yet with every page something vanished. For each text on faith that was carefully illuminated with gold, another on herbs or astronomy was left to rot or rewritten to fit doctrine. The monastic net was invisible but vast, stretching from Ireland to Italy, from France to the far edges of the Holy Roman Empire. Its threads were ink and obedience. A monk who copied a book about healing might cross out the name of an old goddess and replace it with a saint. A passage about the stars could be altered to remind readers that heaven was fixed by God alone. The most dangerous words were not lies but truths that gave people independence. If a woman could learn from a book how to ease pain with a plant or read the sky for weather, she would not need a priest to intercede. So those books were cleansed. Some were translated into the narrow Latin of the Church. Others were quietly sealed in chests, marked heretical or destroyed altogether. The monks who did this were not all villains. Many believed they were saving souls. They copied day and night, their eyes strained by candlelight, their fingers stained with ink. But behind them stood authority, reminding them that not all knowledge was holy. What had once been a library of the world slowly became a mirror of the Church itself. The scriptoria decided what deserved to live and what must die. The result was a kind of selective memory. Ancient works of medicine were reduced to a few harmless fragments. Texts that mentioned midwives or lunar cycles were reinterpreted as metaphors for sin. Astronomy became theology. Philosophy became obedience. The ancient wisdom of Egypt, Greece, and the Celts flowed into the monastic network only to emerge purified and controlled. Outside the monastery walls, the world darkened. The ordinary people forgot the old remedies, the names of constellations, the chants that once accompanied birth and death. But inside the libraries of the Church, those same things were still there, rewritten, reshaped, renamed. Knowledge was not destroyed, it was domesticated. And in this quiet act of rewriting, the Church achieved what no empire had done. It conquered time itself. For centuries, the scriptoria dictated not only what was remembered, but what was possible to imagine. Every book that survived did so because it had passed through the monastic net, scrubbed clean of the feminine, the natural, and the wild. Yet even within those edited pages, the truth left traces. A symbol in a margin, a note in the corner, a drawing of a plant whose name no longer appears in the text. The monks may have purified the words, but the earth they tried to silence still spoke through the ink. For most of human history, the first sound a newborn heard was not the voice of a priest or doctor, but the calm whisper of a midwife. She was the one who guided life into the world, her hands steady, her mind filled with knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations. To her, birth was sacred work, an act of courage and rhythm guided by breath, herbs, and prayer. But what had once been holy soon became heresy. The church began to call these women dangerous. They said the midwife's touch could summon spirits, that her calm during pain was unnatural, that her knowledge of the female body came from forbidden sources. And so the hands that once symbolized life became symbols of sin. It began quietly, as most erasures do. Priests started attending births, not to help, but to watch. They claimed they needed to ensure the newborn was baptized before death. The midwife, once trusted without question, was now watched for signs of witchcraft. If a mother or child died, even by fate, the blame fell on her. People began to whisper that she worked with the devil, that she exchanged the soul of the child for unnatural power. The crime of touch was born. It was a cruel irony. The very thing that made these women healers, their hands, became the proof of their guilt. They were accused of using potions to dull pain, of using herbs to control birth, of knowing too much about life and death. But the truth was simple. They were punished for having knowledge the church could not control. By the 13th century, new church decrees forbade women from practicing medicine. Healing became the domain of men trained in Latin schools, while women who had delivered thousands of babies without ever opening a book were called heretics. The knowledge of birth that had once belonged to every village was now a privilege locked behind cathedral doors. The female body became a mystery not to be studied, but to be judged. Even the miracle of life was reframed as a punishment for sin. Pain was declared holy, and any woman who tried to ease it was accused of defying God's will. The midwives who remained learned to hide. They disguised their herbs as spices, their rituals as prayers, their healing chants as lullabies. They became invisible, yet their work never stopped. They delivered babies in secret, behind closed shutters, whispering not to wake suspicion. And each time a new life took its first breath, it was a quiet act of rebellion. History remembers kings and popes, but not the countless women who kept humanity alive while being hunted for it. The crime of touch was never about evil. It was about control. The church feared the power of women who could give life without permission, who could comfort without blessing, who could stand at the border between life and death and not tremble. Their crime was compassion. Their punishment was fire. In the centuries after the fall of Rome, the church learned that words could do what swords could not. They could reshape thought itself. Inside candle-lit rooms, monks and theologians began to build a new kind of weapon, not of iron, but of ink. From the 8th century onward, the church produced a flood of canons, sermons, and manuals meant to guide every corner of human life. These writings drew invisible lines, dividing what was divine from what was forbidden. A prayer to the Virgin was blessed, but a chant to the moon was sorcery. Healing with holy water was faith, but healing with herbs was witchcraft. The difference lay not in the act itself, but in who had the authority to name it. The theology of prohibition was simple. The church claimed the right to define reality. It turned blessing into something that required permission. Every ritual, every cure, every symbol had to pass through its approval. What could not be controlled was labelled sin. This new power was not loud. It whispered through parchment, through the soft turning of pages in confessionals and classrooms. Priests were trained to listen for heresy in the most ordinary acts. A woman praying alone, a farmer blessing his field without a priest, a mother singing to her child at midnight. Each became a possible gateway to the devil. The manuals of confession became maps of fear. They listed the questions priests should ask, the signs of witchcraft, the penalties for belief in charms or dreams. What had once been everyday culture now became dangerous behaviour. And as people learned to fear their own customs, silence grew. The old songs fell quiet. The stories of goddesses were forgotten, and even the memory of how to heal without permission began to fade. The church did not need to burn every book. It only needed to make people afraid to read them. Ink did the work of fire. The writers of these doctrines often claimed they were protecting souls, but what they really protected was hierarchy. By narrowing the definition of what counted as holy, they turned the infinite into the obedient. The people began to confess not only their sins, but their thoughts. The boundary between conscience and control disappeared. Knowledge was no longer measured by truth, but by approval. And with every confession, every self-accusation, another voice was silenced. Yet even in that silence, resistance survived. A few monks copied forbidden passages in secret, hiding them between pages of theology. Some women remembered the banned prayers and passed them to their daughters as lullabies. Every small act of remembrance became a spark against the dark wall of control. The church may have used ink to cage imagination, but ink can also remember. It stains deeper than the surface. Centuries later, when those old manuscripts are opened, you can still see the faint marks of words once erased. The story of ink and silence was never just about faith. It was about the human mind learning to whisper truth in a world that punished those who spoke it aloud. The fire did not begin with superstition. It began with a book. In the late 15th century, 2 inquisitors wrote a manual that would change Europe forever. It was called The Hammer of Witches, a guide for priests on how to find, question, and destroy those accused of magic. What began as a few scattered fears was turned into law, a system of suspicion with the authority of heaven behind it. The writers claimed they were protecting the world from evil, but their words built a machine of accusation that could never stop once it began to move. Before that time, witchcraft had been a rumour whispered between neighbours, a fear that rose and faded with famine or plague. But now it had rules, it had procedures, it had steps written in Latin and sealed with the church's approval. Every odd behaviour, every unexplained illness, every woman who lived alone or spoke too boldly could fit into its pages. The hammer declared that disbelief in witches was itself heresy, meaning anyone who questioned the hunts risked joining the accused. In one stroke, doubt became a sin, and rumour became proof. Inquisitors travelled from town to town with this book in hand, reading from it as if it were scripture. They used it to justify torture, to force confessions from people who could no longer tell pain from truth. The more someone denied the charge, the guiltier they seemed. The logic was perfect and merciless. Those who screamed were proof of possession. Those who stayed calm were said to be protected by the devil. No one was safe from the net of this new theology. The church kept its hands clean in appearance, claiming it was merely rooting out sin. But the flames that rose across Europe were fueled by that same ink. In some towns, hundreds were tried in a single year. Entire families were erased. And the terrible genius of the system was that it required no real evidence, only fear, a neighbour's jealousy, a child's dream, a priest's suspicion. Once named, a person's fate was sealed. They would be examined, broken, and finally burned. The smell of smoke became the smell of faith. The manual spread faster than any sermon. Printers produced thousands of copies, and soon even small villages had someone who could quote its words. It taught not only how to find witches, but how to think like an inquisitor. The question was no longer whether magic existed, but who to blame for it. The process stripped away humanity, turning the sacred duty of the church into a bureaucracy of cruelty. But even among the inquisitors, some began to doubt. A few saw the madness their work had unleashed and destroyed their copies in secret. Others stayed silent, knowing that to question the fire was to step into it. By the time the flames finally dimmed centuries later, the damage was done. The manual had achieved its purpose. It had taught generations that fear could be organized, that killing could be called justice, and that all it took to light a pyre was a single page of holy ink. There was a time when every village had its healer, a grandmother with jars of dried herbs and bottles of oil that smelled of the forest. Her hands were steady, her voice calm, and her remedies were made of things that grew nearby. She treated fever with willow bark, wounds with honey, and childbirth pain with roots gathered under a full moon. She was not a priest or scholar, but people trusted her because her cures worked. Then the church began to speak a different kind of language, one of relics and miracles. Healing, they said, could not come from the earth, but only from heaven. Illness was no longer a natural event, it was a spiritual test, and relief came not from a potion or herb, but from faith alone. The bones of saints were carried across Europe. Fragments of cloth said to touch Christ were displayed in cathedrals, and pilgrims travelled for days just to brush their fingers against a glass case. The church promised that a single prayer before a relic could cure what generations of healers never could, and if it failed, the fault was not in the relic but in the believer's lack of faith. The idea was powerful and profitable. Cathedrals filled their coffers, towns grew around shrines, and people began to abandon their village healers. The shift was more than spiritual, it was political. The church could not control the forest or the plants that grew within it, but it could control relics and the rituals that surrounded them. So it made one sacred and the other forbidden. To make the relic shine brighter, the apothecary had to burn. By the 13th century, laws banned unlicensed healing. A woman giving herbal medicine without permission could be fined or accused of witchcraft. Slowly the old ways were forgotten. The herbs that once hung in kitchens were replaced with blessed candles. The whisper of prayers to the river spirits was silenced by Latin chants. The very act of trying to heal outside the church's blessing became a crime. Yet even as the faithful lined up to touch relics, many still slipped quietly into the night to knock on the healer's door. They brought their sick children and their secret hope. They knew that the body trusted what was real. The church saw this and responded with threats, declaring that those who sought help from witches would lose their souls. Fear spread, and trust shifted from the hands of the wise woman to the hands of the priest. Miracles replaced medicine, and faith replaced knowledge. But the truth is that the two were never enemies. The church needed the illusion of control more than the people needed the cure. When the healers disappeared, something in humanity vanished with them, the belief that life and nature were partners, not rivals. Even now, buried beneath centuries of doctrine, the roots of that knowledge still grow. Every plant that heals and every seed that nourishes remembers the hands that once cared for them. The grand cathedrals stand tall, but the earth still whispers the recipes the fire could not erase. Before the church took hold of time itself, the year belonged to the earth. People lived by the rhythm of sun and moon, planting when the light returned, harvesting when the air began to cool. Women were the keepers of these rhythms. They marked the seasons with songs and rituals that celebrated birth, growth, death, and renewal. Every turn of the year was sacred. The spring equinox was for sowing, midsummer for light and abundance, autumn for gratitude, and winter for rest and remembrance. These were not just festivals. They were lessons in balance, a way to live in harmony with nature's pulse. But when Christianity spread, it saw in these old celebrations something dangerous. The church understood that whoever controls the calendar controls the soul. So it began to rewrite time itself. The great wheel of the year was broken into straight lines and numbered months. The feast of Imbolc became the feast of St. Brigid. Beltane was turned into a day for saints and martyrs, and the winter solstice was reborn as Christmas. The old meanings were hidden beneath new names. People could still gather and celebrate, but only under the shadow of the cross. What had once been a dance of nature became a timetable of obedience. Women who had led these ancient rites were pushed aside. Their songs were rewritten as hymns, their fires turned into candles for altars, their herbs replaced by holy water. The church did not erase the old magic. It absorbed it, folded it into liturgy, and declared it holy only when performed by priests. But if the same rites were done outside the church walls, under the open sky as they had always been, they were called witchcraft. The cycle of joy and gratitude that had once united communities now became something to fear. Even the days themselves changed meaning. Certain nights were declared unholy. The full moon, once a time for gathering, was turned into a sign of danger. The church taught that spirits walked on those nights and that only prayer could protect the faithful. The calendar became a tool of separation, dividing the sacred from the profane. People learned to live by dates instead of by seasons. Time was no longer a circle, but a ladder leading toward heaven or falling toward sin. And those who still followed the old ways found themselves climbing the wrong side. Yet the memory of the forbidden days never disappeared. In secret, women still marked the turning of the year. They still lit candles when the sun stood still in the sky. They still whispered blessings to the soil before planting. They hid their rituals within Christian festivals, disguising ancient wisdom as simple faith. The church may have claimed the calendar, but the earth never gave it away. Each sunrise, each solstice, each shifting wind still carries traces of the old rhythm, waiting for humanity to remember that time was never meant to be controlled, it was meant to be lived. Every war begins with a weapon, and in the church's war against magic, that weapon was language. Before the fires, before the trials, words themselves were rewritten. In the villages of Europe, language had always been alive. It healed, it blessed, it comforted. A mother's lullaby could calm a fever. A whispered charm could protect a traveller on the road. Words were not superstition. They were an art of harmony between sound and intention, a bridge between the human and the divine. But as the church expanded, it began to build a new world out of ink, one where only priests could define meaning. What once was a charm became a pact with the devil. What was once a song became an incantation. Even simple embroidery that carried patterns of sun and moon was said to hide secret symbols. The old words that had filled daily life were recast as tools of sin. The change was subtle, almost invisible at first. Sermons warned against idle speech and unsanctioned prayers. Confessionals filled with frightened villagers admitting they had muttered a rhyme to ease their child's cough. The priests wrote these down as evidence of witchcraft. Language became a net, a trap that caught anyone who dared to speak in the old tongue of the earth. The church claimed it was protecting truth, but what it truly protected was control. If people believed that words held no power without a priest's blessing, they would never trust their own voices again. And slowly, that is what happened. The oral traditions that once carried generations of knowledge faded. Songs were forgotten. Chants went unsung, and silence crept into the corners of villages. Those who still remembered the old language spoke it only at night, in whispers that could not be overheard. Even names were changed. The goddesses of rivers became nameless spirits. The word witch, once meaning wise, was twisted into terror. It was a rewriting not just of vocabulary, but of reality. To change language is to change thought, and the church knew this. Each sermon, each decree, pushed the people further from their own memory. Yet not all surrendered their tongues. Some continued to hide knowledge in plain sight. A prayer could still hold a spell if one knew how to hear it. A rhyme could still carry a secret meaning. Women embroidered protection into their clothing using patterns passed down as art, not ritual. Words that once filled temples now lived in lullabies, poems, and stories told to children who never knew their double meanings. The war on words was never fully won because words themselves resist captivity. They move like water, finding new paths when blocked. The church could claim to own the language of faith, but it could never erase the language of life. Somewhere between the lines of its holy texts, the old tongue still breathes, waiting for those who listen closely enough to hear it again, not as heresy, but as home. In the dim glow of cathedrals across Europe, there stands a figure who seems out of place. She is not pale or delicate. Her skin is dark as earth, her gaze steady, her presence heavy with silence. They call her the Black Madonna. To pilgrims, she is holy. To scholars, she is a mystery. To history, she is a contradiction. For centuries, the Church has allowed her to stand upon its altars, yet her origins remain unspoken. Her darkness is explained away as candle soot, her strange resemblance to ancient goddesses dismissed as coincidence. But deep within that silence lies the oldest paradox of all. She is the memory the Church could not destroy. Long before cathedrals rose, people prayed to the Mother. She had many names: Isis in Egypt, Cybele in Rome, Brigid in the Celtic lands. She was the giver of life, the protector of children, the keeper of wisdom. When Christianity spread, her image was reshaped into that of Mary, Mother of Christ. Yet something of the old divinity lingered. In statues and paintings, she often remained dark, not with sin, but with power. She was the soil from which life grows, the night that protects the stars. People came to her seeking healing, fertility, and mercy. The same blessings once offered by the goddesses the Church had declared false. The clergy tolerated her worship because they could not stop it. They wrapped her in new prayers, gave her new names, and claimed she was nothing more than a symbol of faith. But the people knew she was more than that. They touched her feet, whispered their hopes, and left offerings that echoed older rituals. In her silence, she became both accepted and forbidden, the Holy Mother and the shadow beneath her own crown. The Church permitted her image, but not her voice. Her mysteries could be admired, but not explained. Her temples could be filled with pilgrims, but never with questions. The Black Madonna stood as proof that the sacred feminine could not be erased, only rebranded. Yet, even rebranded, she remained dangerous. Her darkness frightened those who saw divinity only in light. Her calm strength challenged the idea of a submissive woman, and so she was praised yet never understood, elevated yet contained. Over time, she spread across continents. From France to Poland to Spain, her statues appeared in caves, hills, and hidden chapels. Always, she drew the desperate, the lost, the poor. Always, she remained silent. To look upon her is to see a story written in shadow, a reminder of what was stolen and what still survives. She stands as both sanctuary and secret. The Church's reluctant acknowledgement that it could never entirely bury the divine feminine. Her face, black as fertile soil, tells the truth no sermon dares to speak. That creation itself was once imagined as a woman, and that she still waits behind every altar, watching, remembering, and holding the silence that speaks louder than any prayer. Long before telescopes and observatories, the night sky was the oldest book humanity ever read. Every star was a word, every pattern a story, every movement a sign. In villages scattered across Europe, It was often women who read that sky. They knew when to plant by the rising of certain stars, when to gather herbs by the moon's light, when to expect the change of seasons by the tilt of Orion's belt. They were not astronomers in the formal sense, but they were timekeepers of the earth. Their calendars were written in starlight, their wisdom passed down through memory. Then came the church, and with it a different order of heaven. The sky no longer belonged to those who watched it, but to those who claimed to speak for God. The stars were stripped of their voices and turned into decorations for a divine ceiling. What had been a living dialogue between human and cosmos was suddenly branded superstition. Astrology, once a respected science of kings and scholars, became a forbidden art for commoners. Only certain men, licensed by the church, were permitted to study the heavens, and even they had to tread carefully. A woman seen tracing the moon's path or whispering to the stars risked being accused of calling on demons. The same act that once guided harvests and healings became a mark of heresy. The church's power over the calendar and clock was not just about order, it was about control. If time could be measured only through their sanctioned system, then no one else could define the rhythm of life. The old lunar ways were replaced with solar ones, and the women who had lived by the moon cycle found their knowledge outlawed. They were told that the stars were not to be read, but to be worshipped from afar. The heavens had been fenced in by theology, yet people still looked up. Secretly, they continued to watch the sky, making quiet notes in almanacs hidden beneath beds, recording the return of constellations the church no longer named. In these secret writings, the stars refused to move according to the church's rules. They kept their true positions, unbent by decree. The night remained a classroom where no priest could close the door. The regulation of the heavens was also the regulation of women's nights. For centuries, a woman alone beneath the moon became an image of suspicion. What was she doing there, whispering to the dark? Waiting for spirits? Summoning power? No one asked if she was simply watching the stars she had always known. In this way, the church turned wonder into guilt. But the stars themselves never obeyed. They continued to rise and fall in their ancient rhythm, indifferent to human laws. And every time a woman lifted her eyes to them, she joined a lineage older than any book, older than any creed, older even than the church itself. The sky remained what it had always been, a quiet rebellion glowing above the roofs of those who had forgotten how to listen. Once, the most trusted figures in any village were not priests or kings, but midwives. They held the knowledge of birth, the mysteries of pain and relief, the courage to guide life through blood and breath into the world. They were the guardians of beginnings, the ones who spoke softly when mothers screamed, and who understood the balance between life and death more intimately than any man of Scripture. But as the church's influence spread, this sacred authority was deemed dangerous. A woman who could bring forth life without a priest's blessing threatened the divine monopoly over creation itself. And so the midwives were quietly replaced, not by soldiers or inquisitors at first, but by saints. In the centuries after the fall of Rome, hagiographies, stories of holy men and women, began to multiply. Each saint had a special gift. Saint Margaret protected women in labour. Saint Bridget of Kildare, once a Celtic goddess of fertility and fire, was recast as a Christian abbess. Saint Agatha, whose body was mutilated by persecutors, became the patron of nursing mothers. These new holy figures stepped into the roles once held by the village healers. Their miracles mirrored the old practices almost exactly, only now the prayers were in Latin and the power was said to come from heaven rather than the earth. The stories spread through sermons and painted glass, teaching the faithful that all help came through saints and never through mortal hands. It was a gentle replacement, yet devastatingly effective. The grandmother with her herbs became unnecessary. Her name faded from memory, replaced by the legend of a distant saint whose image could be controlled and whose words could never contradict the church. Women still prayed for safe childbirth, but now they did so before an altar instead of in a garden. They tied ribbons to saintly statues instead of to sacred trees. Slowly, the living midwife became a relic herself, her art reduced to superstition, her wisdom dismissed as pagan nonsense. The new saints were safe because they were silent. They did not teach. They did not heal in person. They were symbols of obedience cloaked in holiness. And the church, by assigning them to the domains of women, appeared compassionate while quietly erasing the lineage of female power. Yet, in many villages, the transition was never complete. Beneath the prayers to Saint Margaret or Saint Bridget, echoes of the old invocations survived. Women whispered both names together, the saint and the goddess, unable to separate the two. They sensed that holiness could not be confined to one faith or one book. The saints who replaced the midwives carried within them the faint reflection of those who came before, proof that erasure can never be total. For even when written out of history, the memory of the midwife endures in every child born safely, in every whispered prayer for life that still rises from the lips of women who know, deep down, that the first priesthood humanity ever had was born from their own hands. Fear has always been a currency, and in medieval Europe, the Church learned how to mint it. What began as a mission to save souls slowly became a machine that turned faith into profit. The more terrified people were of sin, witchcraft, or the devil, the more they gave. Fear filled the offering plates. Fear built cathedrals. Fear kept the population obedient, poor, and dependent. But behind the glittering altars and holy rhetoric lay another story, one in which women bore the greatest cost. For centuries, women had formed small guilds of care, groups of healers, midwives, and wise women who supported their communities. They charged little or nothing for their help. Their wealth was knowledge, not gold. But to a growing church hungry for both power and income, that kind of independence was a threat. The church introduced confession as a spiritual necessity, but it was also a means of surveillance. Secrets once shared among women during childbirth or healing were now confessed to priests. Every private matter passed through the ears of the church. What had once been a circle of trust became a hierarchy of judgment. At the same time, indulgences appeared, promises that a donation could cleanse sins or shorten purgatory. Fear of hell was turned into a marketplace. The poor sold what little they had for invisible salvation, while women who refused to participate were called prideful or heretical. The church's wealth swelled as its sermons grew darker. Sin was no longer an act, it was a state of being, a shadow that could only be lifted through obedience and payment. And when witch trials began to rise, that fear became literal currency. A single accusation could justify seizing the accused's property. Her land, her tools, even her home could be confiscated by the church or the local lords aligned with it. Families who had relied on women's healing skills were left destitute, their care networks dismantled piece by piece. Entire economies shifted from community-based exchange to clerical control. Fear paid for the candles that burned above the altars where those same women had once prayed. The beauty of the system was its invisibility. No one saw it as greed. It was framed as devotion. Every indulgence was an act of piety, every confession a duty, every burned healer a sacrifice for the purity of faith. But the truth was simpler and far colder. Each bonfire was also a transaction, each sermon a sales pitch, each relic a product of fear. By the 15th century, the Church had perfected this balance. It ruled the soul through terror and the body through poverty. Women, once the backbone of care and healing, became scapegoats. Their absence filled with priests, relics, and ritualized obedience. The system thrived on their silence, for silence made fear easier to sell. Yet, beneath it all, a quiet resistance endured. Every woman who whispered an old prayer, every healer who passed down a recipe in secret, every mother who taught her daughter courage instead of fear, each became an act of defiance against the economy of terror that tried to buy the human spirit and call it salvation. The witch trials were not trials at all. They were theatre, a cruel performance in which guilt was decided long before the curtain rose. What was called justice was little more than a ritual of fear, played out in cellars and candlelit chambers where sleep and sanity were stripped away until truth no longer mattered. The accused were almost always women, often widows or healers, people whose independence had already made others uneasy. Once their names were whispered, they were lost. No law could save them, for the Church and the courts had perfected a system where innocence itself became the greatest proof of guilt. It began with the arrest, a knock at night, a torch in the dark, and the sound of boots on stone. The woman would be taken to a cold room where questions began before she could even speak. Did she consort with spirits? Did she harm her neighbour's crops? Did she fly by night? There were no right answers. Denial meant she was cunning. Confession meant she was damned. The interrogations went on for days without food or sleep. Exhaustion broke the mind, faster than torture ever could. Words blurred, and even silence was twisted into admission. In many cases, the so-called evidence came not from deeds, but from dreams. If a villager claimed to see the accused in a nightmare, or to have been struck by her invisible presence, it was enough to bring her to trial. This was called spectral testimony, where ghosts and visions held more weight than truth. The human imagination became the Church's most loyal witness. Gossip too played its part. A jealous neighbour, a priest's suspicion, a child's strange story, all were woven into a tapestry of guilt. Each retelling made it more real until rumour hardened into doctrine. The courtroom was filled with whispers, and every whisper became a nail in the coffin. Those accused were forced to prove a negative, to demonstrate that they had never spoken with spirits, never cursed, never dreamed. How can one prove what has never been done? The test was impossible by design. Even the act of defending oneself was considered arrogance. And when no evidence could be found, the body itself became the final proof. The searchers would strip and examine every inch of skin for the witch's mark, a freckle, a scar, a birthmark, anything that could be called unnatural. When found, it sealed her fate. When not found, they claimed the devil had hidden it. The outcome was always the same: confession through pain, repentance through death. The Church called it purification, a burning to cleanse the soul. But beneath that language of faith lay something far simpler: the destruction of those who could not be controlled. The trials in the dark were not about witches. They were about power, about turning fear into law and accusation into weapon. The women who perished did not fail to prove their innocence. They were never meant to. And the smoke that rose from their pyres was not the sign of victory over evil, but the mark of a civilization terrified of the light. The fire was never only about punishment. It was a lesson, a sermon written in smoke. Each burning was staged with care, arranged not to kill quietly, but to teach loudly. The Church called it purification, but what it truly taught was obedience. When a woman was condemned as a witch, her death became a spectacle meant to burn itself into memory. Villagers were ordered to attend. Bells rang not for mass, but for execution. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see better, to remember better. The fire spoke the language of fear more fluently than any priest ever could. The accused stood bound to a stake, surrounded by men who claimed to save her soul while tightening the ropes around her wrists. Her supposed crimes were read aloud, healing without permission, gathering herbs under the moon, speaking to the sick in ways unapproved by the church. The crowd listened as if the words themselves carried contagion. The priest would then offer her one final mercy, a chance to repent before the flames reached her feet. If she confessed, she was told she might still reach heaven. If she refused, her silence was branded proof of evil. Either way, the fire was lit. The crowd stepped back. The smell of burning herbs, cloth, and flesh filled the air. For years afterward, that smell lingered in the mind of every witness. It was not just a killing, it was programming. The people learned that the line between holiness and heresy was as thin as smoke, and that to question it was to risk joining it. A mother would think twice before passing down her grandmother's remedies. A girl who knew how to set a broken bone might pretend ignorance rather than skill. Fire was cheaper than debate, more permanent than sermons. It replaced trust with terror, and knowledge with submission. The executions turned whole regions into classrooms of silence. Everyone learned the same lesson: do not stand out, do not speak what you know, do not be seen doing what was once sacred. The church called this moral reform, but it was social control. Every pyre was a warning written in flames, and as the smoke rose, it carried away not just the body of the condemned, but centuries of wisdom. The plants she once used were trampled, the field where she gathered them became cursed ground, her home was torn down or given to the accuser. In this way, fire erased her from both memory and map. Yet something in that fire also refused to die. The very act meant to erase fear left a scar that still burns in the collective mind. The villagers walked home in silence, eyes lowered, hearts trembling, and somewhere deep inside, a question flickered like a dying ember. If this is what holiness looks like, who truly stands in the light? The flames taught them to fear the feminine mind, but they also exposed the cruelty of those who claimed to save it. When the written word became dangerous, women learned to write in ways no priest could read. Knowledge did not vanish, it changed its form. It hid itself in plain sight, wrapped in rhyme and rhythm, stitched into fabric, whispered into songs meant for children. The world called it domestic work, but it was survival in code. After the fires and the trials, anything resembling the old knowledge had to disappear or disguise itself. Healing herbs were renamed kitchen spices. Protective charms became embroidery patterns. Astronomical cycles were marked not on parchment, but in gardens where flowers bloomed according to secret calendars. The language of survival was no longer Latin or law. It was the quiet grammar of everyday life. A woman could not write down a formula for a fever cure, but she could bake a certain bread with specific herbs at a certain time of year. A song hummed to a crying child could hold instructions for childbirth hidden behind nonsense words. Even fairy tales became maps. The wicked stepmother, the forest, the forbidden fruit, all were echoes of real dangers and old wisdom disguised as stories. The church saw only superstition, never realizing that its victims were building an invisible school beneath their notice. The loom became a library. Lace patterns told stories of constellations and seasons. The number of petals on a flower in an embroidered border might match the number of days in a healing cycle. The weave of a shawl could carry hidden meaning known only to those who understood its rhythm. It was an alphabet made of beauty, a rebellion dressed as art. In kitchens, recipes replaced grimoires. Every ingredient was a word in a lost language. Women passed them to daughters as innocent tradition. Add this herb for flavour, they would say, never explaining that it eased pain or warded off infection. What had once been sacred ritual was now folded into bread, dough and soup, carried quietly from one generation to the next. The church had taken their books, but not their hands. The hands remembered. Gardens too became coded texts. Where a priest saw flowers, a healer saw formulas. Plants placed near the door kept sickness away. Flowers that bloomed by moonlight reminded them of the old ways when women measured time by the stars. Knowledge lived in soil, in pattern, in the gentle repetition of gestures too ordinary to seem dangerous. In this hidden grammar, silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Women learned to speak without speaking, to teach without teaching, to remember without records. And though centuries passed, the code never broke. Even today, fragments of it survive. The song you cannot forget, the recipe your grandmother never measured but always knew, the lace hanging in an old window that no one ever takes down. These are the ghosts of a forbidden language, still alive, still whispering that wisdom never truly dies. It only changes its shape until it is safe to be spoken again. The cathedrals of Europe rise like frozen prayers, but beneath their stone and glass lies a secret language older than the church that built them. Every arch, every window, every shaft of light was not merely designed for worship, but to preserve knowledge that could not be spoken aloud. The builders, many of them masons and scholars who carried fragments of pre-Christian wisdom, encoded the cosmic feminine into geometry. They hid it in plain sight, knowing that while sermons could change with every century, stone would remember what words forgot. The great Gothic cathedrals were built during a time when women were being silenced and burned, yet within those walls are the echoes of a sacred balance. The arches curve like wombs, the vaults rise like ribs, and at the heart of every nave lies the vesica piscis, an almond-shaped opening formed by the intersection of two circles. To theologians, it symbolized the coming together of heaven and earth. But to those who still understood the old mysteries, it represented the feminine principle, the gateway of life. The builders never named it as such, but they carved it into portals, windows, and rose patterns so that the divine feminine would never truly vanish. Light itself became part of the secret design. The stained glass of Chartres and Notre Dame does more than decorate. It teaches. When sunlight passes through the blue and red glass, it turns the floor into a living script of colour and shadow. The timing of that light, falling precisely on certain days, aligns with solstices and equinoxes, echoing the ancient lunar and solar rhythms once celebrated by priestesses and midwives. The church saw only beauty, the masons saw memory. Beneath some cathedrals lie labyrinths, winding paths that pilgrims once walked in silence. Officially, they symbolize the journey to salvation, but their spiral forms mirror the patterns of the womb, the moon, and the cycles of birth and renewal. To walk the labyrinth was to participate in a secret meditation, to remember the body's wisdom hidden beneath the weight of theology. Even the statues that line cathedral walls tell two stories. On the surface, they are saints and angels. But look closer and you will find faces that resemble older deities, hands that hold flowers sacred to forgotten goddesses, postures that recall fertility rites long denounced by the church. The Masons knew how to blend truth with disguise. They built sanctuaries that could satisfy bishops, while whispering to those who still remembered that spirit and nature were once one. Cathedrals became stone libraries where geometry replaced forbidden text. The sacred feminine was exiled from doctrine, but she lived on in design. Even now, if you stand in the quiet of a cathedral at noon and watch how the light bends through coloured glass, you can still feel her presence, soft, mathematical, eternal. The church may have claimed to build for God, but the builders carved something far older into every pillar, a reminder that divinity was never meant to belong to one gender, one book, or one voice, but to the balance of all creation. In the smoky corners of medieval alchemy labs, behind sealed doors and veiled symbols, the feminine never vanished. It only changed its name. While the church erased women from pulpits and texts, their essence slipped quietly into esoteric scrolls and mystical diagrams. Alchemy became a refuge, not only for secret science, but for the sacred feminine herself. There, she was not burned, she was transformed. One of her oldest names was Sophia. She was not a woman in the flesh, but wisdom in a pure form. Alchemists described her as divine insight, the spark that guided transformation. In sacred texts, Sophia appeared as a light in darkness, a voice that whispered just before revelation. Though the priests denied her, the philosophers called upon her. They said she lived in the soul of the world, hidden like gold in stone, waiting to be remembered. Her symbols were not crosses or crowns, but the spiral, the circle, the rose. She was not worshipped with sermons, but studied with reverence. Another name was the anima, the soul within all things. Alchemists saw the world as made of two forces, masculine and feminine, each incomplete without the other. The anima was the secret force that animated matter, the breath behind the transformation of lead into gold. She was the reason the work was called the Great Work. To reach enlightenment, one had to unite the opposites. This was not just a chemical process, it was spiritual marriage. A man had to meet the feminine within himself. Only then could true balance be achieved. In dreams and visions recorded in their journals, alchemists often described meeting a mysterious woman. She would appear beside a fountain, or in the smoke of a flask, or in the stars above their heads. She gave riddles, never answers. She guided, but never ruled. She was the guardian of secrets the world was too afraid to speak aloud. Some knew her as Maria the Prophetessa. She was said to live in ancient Alexandria, the only woman whose name still glows at the root of Western alchemy. Maria is credited with creating tools still used today, including the bain-marie, a method of gentle heating. But more than her inventions, it was her words that echoed. She once said, "One becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth." This was not a riddle of science. It was a map of transformation, written in the grammar of mystery. The church never canonized her, but the alchemists did. They wrote her name in the margins of their secret books, alongside veiled drawings of queens, serpents, and womb-like vessels. Even when women were banished from learning, their symbols remained. Alchemy never shouted their names, but it never forgot them either. The feminine was not lost. She was encoded. And in every diagram, in every strange Latin phrase, she waits like a sleeping ember, ready to awaken in the minds of those who dare to see beyond the surface, into the place where fire becomes light. And Lead remembers it was always meant to be gold. When the printing press arrived in Europe in the 15th century, it was celebrated as a miracle of progress. Books that once took years to copy could now be made in days. Ideas moved faster than ever before, but not all ideas were born of light. The same machines that spread scripture and science also mass-produced terror and fear. it turns out, sold better than truth. Pamphlets appeared by the thousands, cheap and easy to print. They were passed from hand to hand, read aloud in markets, and nailed to tavern doors. Some warned of demons, others detailed the confessions of witches. Always they pointed to a darkness hiding among the people. The message was clear. Evil wore the face of a woman. Woodcuts gave these fears a shape. With thick lines and heavy shadows, they etched her into memory. The crooked nose, the black cat, the flying broom, a cauldron bubbling with secrets, a twisted tree under a moon too large to be real. These images were not meant to record history. They were built to brand it, and once burned into the eye, they were nearly impossible to unsee. In a time when most people could not read, pictures spoke louder than words. They told you who to fear without needing a sermon. But the fear they sold was not random. It had a pattern. The women shown in these prints were often alone, old, or surrounded by symbols of knowledge, books, herbs, stars. They were not villains. They were mirrors held up to the parts of society that no longer fit the church's design. And so the press, that tool of enlightenment, became an engine of erasure. Ballads spread alongside the pamphlets. Set to simple tunes, they told stories of witches stealing babies, cursing livestock, consorting with devils. These songs were catchy and cruel, sung by children as games and whispered by adults in fear. They turned myth into memory. A child raised on these verses did not need to see a witch to believe in her. She already lived in his head. What printing did was scale fear. Before, a rumour might die in the village where it started. Now, with ink and press, it could jump borders. A witch burned in one country could become a cautionary tale in another. Her story, distorted and reprinted, travelled farther than she ever had in life. Some printers grew rich on these terrors. They knew that nothing sold like a good panic, and so they printed more. More confessions, real or invented, more woodcuts, each darker than the last. More songs, more sermons, more fuel for the fire. And slowly, Europe itself began to look like one vast stage for a play that no one knew how to stop. The witch was no longer just an accusation. She was a brand. A shadow cast over the land by the very machines that promised to bring knowledge. And in that shadow, truth was forgotten. What remained was an echo of footsteps, a smear of ink, and a name whispered in fear by a world that had learned to fear its own reflection. The fire did not stay in Europe. It crossed oceans, packed into ships beside crosses and muskets. The witch hunts were not just a chapter in European history. They became part of the colonizers' script. Wherever empire spread, so did the fear of the feminine mind. In the name of salvation and civilization, native women who carried ancient knowledge found themselves branded with a word they had never spoken: witch. When European powers carved up the globe, they did not come empty-handed. They brought their gods, their laws, and their fears. The blueprint for burning had already been tested. They had refined it over centuries in their own towns and villages. Now, with new lands to claim, they turned that fire outward. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, colonizers met cultures where women were healers, midwives, storytellers, astronomers, and priests. These women were the keepers of oral traditions and plant medicine. They knew the stars, the seasons, the spirits of the land. In many tribes and communities, they held authority equal to or even greater than men. To European eyes, trained by sermons and inquisitors, this was not wisdom, it was rebellion. And rebellion had to be renamed. A healer became a sorceress. A priestess became a devil's bride. A ceremony became a curse. The colonizers did not always need fire. Often, the weapon was shame. Native women were forced to choose between silence and survival. They were told their songs were sins, their rituals were demonic, their gods were lies. The pressure came from pulpits and schools, from government offices and mission houses. The goal was always the same: erase the old world, replace it with one that obeyed. In Salem, Massachusetts, the witch trials echoed Europe's madness, but with a colonial twist. Some of the first women accused were enslaved or indigenous. Their otherness made them easier to blame. Their knowledge, once respected in their own lands, became the proof of their guilt. Across continents, the story repeated. In West Africa, women who worked with roots were suddenly feared. In the Andes, midwives were silenced. In Southeast Asia, wise women disappeared from village councils. Everywhere the church and empire moved, they left behind a scorched trail of forgotten names. And yet, even with oceans between them, the patterns were the same: accusation, isolation, confession, punishment. It was the same machinery of control, now painted in colonial colours. The fire had changed form, but not purpose. It was still used to frighten women into silence and communities into obedience. Still used to turn memory into myth and wisdom into crime. But like in Europe, something always remained. The old songs were hummed under breath. The stories were retold in kitchens, gardens, and fields. The knowledge folded itself into prayers and dreams, waiting for a time when it could rise again. The pyre may have been exported, but so too was resistance. And across the world, the women who were never meant to survive found ways to pass the flame forward, not to burn, but to light the way back to truth. The word never died, it just changed shape. Witch, what once condemned women to fire, now follows them like smoke. It floats through centuries, across languages and borders, always finding new ways to accuse. It no longer needs courts or trials. Just a whisper, a look, a silence broken in the wrong room. The word witch has outlived the flames that made it famous, but the spell it cast still lingers. Once it was spoken by priests in stone chambers, backed by laws and torches. Now it appears in headlines, in gossip, in the sneer of those who fear a woman they cannot control. The charge is rarely literal anymore, but its meaning is just as sharp. A witch is a woman who will not bow, a woman who leads when told to follow, who remembers when the world wants her to forget, who heals outside the system, who speaks when silence is safer. She might wear a suit or an apron or a crown of flowers. She might stand at a podium or dance barefoot in the woods. She might call herself a CEO or a midwife or an artist. It does not matter. The word still finds her. And when it does, it tries to shrink her into something fear can understand to witch. It is not a description, it is a warning. It tells others to keep their distance, to question her motives, to laugh behind closed doors, to take what she builds and claim it as their own. The label is still used to control, to isolate, to punish. And yet, something else has happened. The word has begun to turn. What was once only a curse has become a mirror, a symbol reclaimed, a banner raised. Across the world, women now call themselves witches, not with shame, but with pride. They wear the word like armor, not because they worship darkness, but because they understand light too well to fear it. They gather in circles. They study herbs and stars and dreams. They write books and spells and laws. They remember the ones who burned, and they build something new from the ashes. But even this reclaiming does not erase the danger. The word is still sharp. It still draws blood in places where fear rules louder than truth. In some countries, the accusation still kills. A woman heals a neighbour and is stoned. A girl speaks too boldly and is cursed. The old spell has not been broken, only rewritten. The long afterlife of the word witch is a story of survival, a spell cast across time, a curse that became a question, and now a name that refuses to disappear. What was meant to erase became a way to endure, and the women who carry it today do so not in darkness, but in memory. They are not witches because they are feared. They are feared because they remember, and that memory is the oldest magic of all. The fires were meant to end it, to burn away the names, the knowledge, the songs, the hands that healed without permission. But fire only touches the surface. It cannot reach what lives below. Beneath the ash, seeds waited, in silence, in darkness, and now they stir again. What the fire could not kill was memory. Not the kind written in books or carved into stone, but the kind that flows like water and echoes like lullabies. It passed from hand to hand, hidden in gardens and gestures, in the quiet patterns of daily life. A recipe remembered, a moon watched, a song hummed under breath. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of return, not defiance, but continuity, the kind that refuses to vanish no matter how many times it is erased. Memory is a river. It bends and disappears underground, but it always finds a way back to the surface. The question now is not whether we have lost the wisdom, it is whether we are ready to remember it. The stories we have told in this series are not just history, they are maps, warnings, invitations. They are not finished. They wait for us to step into them, to read the margins, to question what we were taught to forget. For centuries we were told to fear the feminine in all its forms, not just in women, but in earth and moon, in cycles and silence, in mystery and emotion. These were called weak, dangerous, wrong. But we now know that what was feared was never weakness, it was power. Power that could not be controlled by doctrine or crown. Power that healed without hierarchy. Power that spoke in symbols the church could not translate. The moon still watches. She has never stopped rising. She carries the same light that guided midwives, priestesses, astronomers, mothers, daughters. She knows the way back to a world where wisdom is not burned but honoured. The path is not straight. It is not marked by stone. It is marked by memory. If you follow it, you will find strange things. Herbs with forgotten names. Symbols that still hum with meaning. Stories that were never supposed to survive, but survive they did. And now they call to you. This is not just the end of a story. It is a beginning. A spell cast not in fear, but in hope. A chance to ask the old questions again. Not because we want to repeat the past, but because we are ready to remember what it still has to teach. What the fire could not kill is in you. In your hands, your dreams, your voice. Let it rise. Let it speak. Let it grow. The ash is thick, but the seeds are ready. All they need is light.